if we. Thank you so much. We're going to call this meeting to order now. It is 7:05 on August 29, 2022, and this is the 8th public meeting of the City of Portland Accountability Commission Subcommittee on Research. I'm Christine Moses, and I am your facilitator along with Victoria Laura. If the Spanish language interpreters, Talia and Luis, can please give the information on Spanish language interpretation, that would be lovely. I'm not hearing the interpreters.
I am so sorry. Can you go ahead and repeat that, please? I apologize.
Sure. If you could give us the information.
Yes, I just
interpretation, that would be lovely.
Yes, if you can do the first thing that you just mentioned real quick.
Oh, I can do that, sorry.
Okay.
Buenos días a todos. Vamos a empezar la reunión. Son las 7:05, entonces soy la doctora Christine y vamos a empezar de la policía de accountabilidad. Vamos a empezar, esta reunión va a ser grabada y nosotros vamos a tener acceso a la interpretación en español para las personas que lo necesitan.
Thank you so very much. The city also offers Asl Interpretation, which is being provided by Heidi and Jackie. You can pin their video feed if that is helpful to. Only the captioning is turned on in Zoom and other means of assistance. Please, this is automatic service. It is not always accurate. Can provide other languages as well. Meetings either as a response to a big meetings or directly to police accountability at portlandoregon.gov to ask for other assistance, including interpretation into other languages. This meeting is a public meeting subject to City of Portland Administrative Code and Oregon state law, and is being recorded. For this meeting, the chat function is enabled for commission members to communicate with each other. Members of the public will be able to ask questions using Zoom's Q&A feature. As the commissioners are presenting and or discussing things, if attendees have questions, please feel free to submit them through the Q&A. We hope to use this feature to help guide our conversation during the meeting and future meetings and agenda topics. We'd like to be clear that not all questions will be answered during the meeting, but if answered, both the question and the answer will be visible to you and will become part of the meeting record. To access this feature, just click on the Q&A icon in the middle of your screen. Next slide, please. The purpose of our land acknowledgement is to center the traditional native inhabitants of the land upon which we live. We want to respectfully acknowledge the Chinook, the Clatskanie, the Kalapuya, and the Multnomah and the Clackamas, two tribal nations who are missing from this map, who are now part of the Confederated Tribes of the Grand Ronde. because of the genocide that occurred in the creation of this country. We honor those who have stewarded this land throughout the generations, and we pay our respects to the elders, both past and present. Thank you. Next slide. I would I would like to invite into read community agreements, please. Read them to yourselves, and then I will add the next slide to advance. Next slide, please. Thank you. May I have a thumbs up indicating that you agree with these community agreements? Thank you so much. Next slide, please. I'll pass it over to the co-chairs to discuss the timeline. Co-chairs?
Thank you so much. Just give me 1 second. I'm reading from the small screen today.
You got it.
1 second. I'm sorry. I'm still trying to pull it up from the small screen. Give me a moment, please.
Is there a way you would like me to support you, Commissioner Sophia?
Yes. If you could read the first part while I pull this up, that would be great. I'm so
Sure.
sorry.
No, sure, I'd be glad to. The commission is currently in the fact-finding phase of work, expected to go into early September. It includes hearing from key stakeholders, identifying barriers to accountability in Portland presently, and examining systems of accountability from other jurisdictions and proposals from subject matter experts. It also includes increased community engagement work. Future phases of this work will develop the parameters for the new police accountability system before the commission presents that to the council in 2023 for their consideration and approval. Next slide.
Okay, I'm ready. Following today's meeting are the next steps for several upcoming meetings for the PAC. This subcommittee will meet again on Thursday, September 1st. The full PAC will meet next Thursday, September 8th, and following Thursday, September 15th. We also have some tentative dates coming up. The commission will not meet over the Labor Day holiday. In the next slide, please. This slide is the current project plan for the fact-finding phase of the Police Accountability Commission's work. It's not their agendas, and and it is updated regularly. This slide is mostly for members of the public to be able to understand how the commission gets from now through to the end of the phase, which focuses on identifying areas of agreement among commission members as to barriers to accountability in the current system, best practices from Portland and other jurisdictions, and suggestions to consider from experts, as well as asking for public comment and meeting with key stakeholders. So today's meeting is in the green box towards the bottom right of the screen with the purple border. Next slide, please. As part of completing the fact-finding phase, the full commission will consider and ideally approve 3 documents, which are listed on this page. The first 2 are being developed in the subcommittee for eventual referral to the full commission, where they will be discussed again and before being approved. And the third of which focuses on barriers to police accountability in the current system in Portland, as well as best practices in Portland, and is being developed at the full commission level throughout this phase as well. Review of today's meeting purpose is on the next slide. Okay, today's meeting agenda focuses on the first 2 draft documents just mentioned, which are being developed in the subcommittee and eventually referred to the full commission for their approval. There are the draft areas of agreement and best practices and practices to avoid from other jurisdictions as well. I'm sorry, as well as the draft areas of agreement on suggestions to consider and proposals to avoid from subject matter experts. We will spend most of our time addressing the draft documents. During these discussions, members may also reference any of the documents posted to the PAC website under the Subcommittee on Research Resources. There's also public comment during today's meeting. The draft PAC areas of agreements on best practices and practices avoid from other jurisdictions. Slide 11, please. Oh, I'm sorry, it's your turn.
Well,
thank you so much.
Sure. Thank you so much, Commissioner Sophia. Yes. Before we get started, are there any new research notes to be presented or updates to previous research that any subcommittee members would like to present to the group? If we can stop screen for a second, that might be helpful. Commissioner Debbie.
So I sent something in yesterday, I think, and it was just one item to add under findings. So I emailed it to Samir, and I'm assuming, I just want to make sure it doesn't get lost, but yeah, I'm assuming that he's got it. But yeah, I don't know if it's in the current version.
When we get there, Commissioner Debbie, to that findings section, we can double check. Thank you so much. Commissioner Dan.
Hi, I'm Dan Handelman, a commissioner, he, him pronouns. And yeah, I also sent some items that were actually from Commissioner Jason's research from earlier this month. They didn't get incorporated into the document that we were sent earlier this morning, but I think, or even this evening, but I think that staff said that they'd be in the one that we see on the screen tonight. So that's another thing to keep an eye out for. So it's all the stuff from Washington, D.C. Thank you.
Okay, that's really helpful. Thank you, Commissioner Dan. Appreciate that. And also Commissioner Jason for his hard work. Okay, so let's see. The next thing we should do is to do the brief walkthrough of the spreadsheet. Today, we will complete the process of going through the spreadsheet. starting from the bottom and working our way up. This will be the last time we focus on the spreadsheet. Later in this meeting and during Thursday's meeting, we will be going through the draft document. For categories we read last week, we will only be reading new items in those categories. After that, we'll read a full category or 5 lines at a time if there are longer categories. Each time we pause, we will ask, would anyone like to flag either this item or its proposed designation as a best practice or a practice to avoid, or for further discussion? This is an open discussion and we ask you to follow our normal discussion rules. Please be brief each time you speak, even though you can speak multiple times. Please be facilitated and remember that we are now using a weighted stack in our discussions. Finally, please be forward-looking in your comments. So we are going to go to the spreadsheet. I'm going to ask staff to go to the spreadsheet, and we will be addressing new items in the spreadsheet. Would you like to share, staff?
Just a moment, please.
Here, you betcha. Excellent. I'm trying to make things bigger on my screen so I can read them. All right, I see that there is an item for 13. This is under Chief Police Commissioner required to implement respond. So the description of the practice is chief must impose discipline based on finding, but can appeal the ruling, which is reviewed by 3 legally trained complaint examiners. And it says in the line to the far right, suggested as best practice, practice to avoid, or no designation. Not necessarily appropriate. Subcommittee, what would you, how do you view this? Is it a best practice? Is it a practice to avoid, or no designation? And since so
Christine, Commissioner Dan has raised his hand.
right, I'm sorry, it's, yeah, this is difficult.
I can help you, don't worry.
Yeah, I would really appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Dan?
Thank you. So I added this from Commissioner Jason's research, and I only left it in because I always feel like there's going to be some trickery down the line where language that we that we all read that's in the charter amendment is going to be interpreted in a way that we didn't expect. So that if there's some reason that the chief ends up having some say in the discipline, we might want to consider that still has to come back to somebody at the board to review rather than the chief getting to overturn the board. So that's the only reason I left it in here. And I said, that's why I said it's not necessarily appropriate because, you know, at the way things are written, the chief in Portland is supposed to not even be involved in discipline at this point. It's just supposed to be the board has the final say. But I thought we should have this flagged so that if we have to think about that as a, you know, kind of an escape valve, that'll be there.
Thank you for your explanation, Commissioner Dan. That's very helpful. So does this item need further discussion? We can move on to the next. Location of office, located in private office space. Practice to consider. Does anyone want to flag this item for further discussion or its designation as a best practice or a practice to avoid? And again, Victoria, if you can help me with raised hands, that would be great.
Yes, of course, I will do that. Nobody has raised their hands.
Very good. So the next one I'll read is Commission on Police Practices is able to set its own internal processes. This is from San Diego. And again, does anyone want to flag this item for further discussion or its designation as a best practice or a practice to avoid?
Christine, there is no one. Mhm.
Very good. Board compensation. Board is not compensated. Does anyone want to flag this item for further discussion or its designation as a practice to consider or a practice to avoid?
Again, nobody has raised their hand.
Very good. Time frame for investigating complaints, 180 days, but most are done more quickly. Does anyone want to flag this item for further discussion or its designation as a practice to consider or a practice to avoid?
And Commissioner Dan, please.
Yes, thank you. I flagged this because there are some places where the police collective bargaining units made it so that if the city goes over the deadline that's written down, that the officer automatically let off, which I don't think is a good practice at all. So I just want to make sure that's not what goes on in Washington, D.C. I made a note that we should probably find out what happens after 180 days, but I certainly don't want that to be part of the new board that we have, where if 180 days pass, that the whole thing gets dropped. That would not be good. So it's just something to follow up on.
Thank you, Commissioner Dan. Did I see Commissioner Sophia?
Yes. Mhm.
Yes, I just wanted to flag that one too, just to further discussion for the time limit. That's all. Thank you.
Bye.
We'll move to the next one. This is on findings. Sustained out of policy, exonerated in policy, unfounded did not happen as alleged, and insufficient facts for different potential findings. Does anyone want to discuss this item further, or its designation as a practice to consider, or its designation as a not necessarily appropriate practice?
Commissioner Dan, and then Commissioner Sophia.
Oh, sorry, do you want to go first, Commissioner Glenn? Okay, so what I'm thinking is that when we get to this section, when this is translated over to a Word document, I would just love to see, because essentially all the boards have the same 4 basic findings, but they have different names for them. I would just like to see those kind of stacked on top of each other so that we can use them as a smorgasbord to decide which ones we think are the best, or if we have a better name for them. So the reason I even put this in at all is because their finding for insufficient evidence has a different name than we've seen before. It's called insufficient facts in Washington, D.C.
Thank you, Commissioner Dan. Commissioner Sophia.
Yes, I was just gonna also say, just let's have that for further discussion to decide if there are any others or how we would like to define those findings as a group.
Beautiful. Next one, please. This is about community engagement.
And Dr. Christine, Commissioner Debbie has raised her hand before reading. Is that, I don't know if she wants to say something from the past, or you were going to?
I wanted to say something from that findings category, because that was where I sent in the Seattle findings that I thought were, and I added it into the spreadsheet and sent it back. But I just want to see if it made it in there, because they had some interesting options that I would like to have in the, I think it'd be great to have in the mix of ones that we consider.
It does not,
You want me to send it again? Would that be the best thing to do?
yes.
Okay, sounds
Got it.
good.
I thought it came in. Just a moment, sorry. I'm trying to unmute here while I'm doing everything else.
So I think I sent an updated spreadsheet with just that one addition. I think it was yesterday.
Yeah, it's here.
Yes, Debbie, I did see that. Just want to let you know I saw it.
Okay. But whatever's easier for you, Samir, I can send it again, or if it's easier for you to find it,
Got it.
we can hold off and, let's not hold up the show here. We can just keep it in the back of our minds.
That's wonderful. Okay, so we'll continue on. Thank you so much for that, Commissioner Debbie. We'll make sure that's included. And thank you, Victoria, for catching Commissioner Debbie's comment. I really appreciate that.
There it is. If you'd like to go through that.
Oh,
one.
beautiful. Okay. Sustained and not sustained. If they find a case is not sustained, the finding is accompanied by one of the following explanations: unfounded, lawful and proper, inconclusive, training referral, that is, officer receives training and counseling, management action, that is, the employee may have acted contrary to policy, but due to a potential deficiency in policy or training, Office of Police Accountability issues a recommendation to the police department to revise policy or training. Any further consideration as a practice to consider or not necessarily appropriate and a practice to avoid? Moving on. Under community engagement, staff expressed, this is two different ones. Okay, staff expressed concern that community member involvement, including by those who helped put the system on the ballot, interfered with the ability to get work done. An example was having to go to start a search process for a staff position a second time. This is, may I have a conversation around if this is a practice to consider or not necessarily appropriate and a practice to avoid? Very good.
Yes, nobody has raised their hand.
Thank you. Public affairs staff does outreach to youth and community partners, including Know Your Rights talks, also training for new officers and presentations to union representatives. Is this a practice to consider? Is this a practice to avoid? No conversation, we'll move forward. Yep. Mediation. Mediation program run by the police department. Not necessarily appropriate. If no one has, if no one has a disagreement, we'll move on. Thank you. We have some feedback here. Okay, complaint process. Anyone can make a complaint. Parents of minors can make a complaint on behalf of a child. Practice to consider. Any conversation? Not hearing any. Let's.
Commissioner Dan raised his hand. Go ahead.
Sorry about that, Dr. Moses. I know it's hard for you to see. Are you able to put the view into gallery view when you're looking at this share screen? Or I don't know. Anyway, I have to keep switching mine on and off. I flagged this because I find it interesting that it says adult can file on complaint on behalf of a child. I don't know if that's defined anywhere. There's different thresholds for different things people can do as they're becoming adolescents and turning into adults. And there may be a point where an adult filing a complaint on behalf of a child is an annoyance to the child if they didn't want to do it. So I don't know how to handle that, but it'd be just something I've wanted to flag for further discussion.
Thank you. Thank you. Structure. Review system is supported by local law school. Practice to consider. Any discussion? Very good. Next one. Subpoena power and compelling testimony. Compelled testimony comes from police order. Requests scheduling goes through the court notification system, which has access to vacation and leaves and tracks if an officer does not appear. Not necessarily appropriate. Any conversation? Very good. Investigators have a subpoena power, but rarely use it. They do not have access to police records, but receive them upon request. Again, not necessarily appropriate. Commissioner Dan.
So Commissioner Renault's comment about this was that the staff from the DC board said they think that Portland's board should get direct access to police files, which I can't remember if that's explicitly written into the charter or not. So it's something to keep in mind.
Further discussion. Access to police files. As proposal to consider. Thank you so much. Keep going. Hearing process. Complaints that are accepted are heard by an administrative judge hired on a case-by-case basis who can hold additional hearings and gather information. Not necessarily appropriate. Any conversation? Following CPP's review, a police department shooting review board examines the case for policy, tactics, and training issues. CPP can disagree with their findings. Not necessarily appropriate.
And Commissioner Dunn.
Yes.
So again, I mean, I could spend all night talking about this particular line, but a lot of these side issues to the shooting, when there's an officer involved shooting, are sort of treated as afterthoughts here in Portland as well right now in the police review board. And I just want to make clear that my thought is that the review board should look at all the aspects of the incident involving a shooting at one time and not separate them out to different places. So that was my note in this.
Thank you. All right. Okay, so our next stop is line 229, and we're going to be going through each of these all the way to number 1. So that is our task to get through this evening, in addition to the other document. So let's start down there at 229. And I believe
Dr. Moses.
yes.
We last week decided to go from bottom to top by category,
Okay.
but within the category to go from top to bottom, as some
Oh, I
commission
see.
members mentioned that there are lower lines that refer to higher lines.
Got it.
So and to clarify the blue for everyone, the blue just was an indicator that we had gone through all the categories below that, but nothing from blue on up. So line 229 on up is things that have been in the spreadsheet, but or possibly just added, but not yet talked about.
So we've gone through the new things that were added, and discipline is the topic at hand. So I'm going to read these, and the 5 of them, and we'll discuss. All discipline is through the chief of police, but it must be imposed based on findings by administrative judge. Commanding officer notifies board of proposed discipline. They can say if it is consistent with discipline matrix. Board can recommend discipline in cases they investigate or when complaints are made. Need to clarify this. If recommended, sustained findings, investigators recommend discipline. If recommendation is less than 10 days without pay, it goes to chief. If greater, goes to police commission. Commissioner Dan.
So the line about the one that needs to be clarified from San Diego City, I couldn't get the staff person I talked to explain that to me, and I get why the reason I want to flag that is the charter allows this board, the new board, to pick and choose which cases it wants to hear. Even if every complaint goes to them, the board itself may not hear all the cases. So there may be cases where they will want to recommend discipline even though they didn't have a hearing on it. And so that's kind of why I want to flag that line.
Very good. Looking at these, is there any discussion to be had in terms of not necessarily appropriate or a practice to consider? I'll read those to the right the next time we go through the next set. But I'm wondering, is there any discussion that we need to have on these 5 items? Commissioner Sophia.
By leaving, I just want to make clear, by leaving them, it's saying.
We can't hear you, Commissioner.
Is that correct?
Commissioner Sophia, we can't hear you.
They're not going to be considered as a. I'm sorry, I had it muted or I didn't hear you respond.
Very good. We can hear you now.
Okay. You couldn't hear me before. I'm so sorry. I was saying when we have these listed as not necessarily appropriate, I just wanted to make sure that they're not being considered as a practice, proposed practice, correct?
Correct.
Okay. Well.
Any further clarification needed?
I was just giving it a quick read over. Number 215, it says if recommended sustained finding, investigators recommend discipline. I guess yes, that's a practice consider. Okay, thank you. I just wanted to be clear before I let us move on to the next one. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. All right, the next 5, please. Officer can be fired for giving false testimony to investigators. Practice to consider. Police commissioner imposes discipline, has final say. Not necessarily appropriate. Discipline may include instruction, training time off, up to 10 days without pay. Commander can impose. Warning and admonition, loss of vacation, suspension, dismissal, probation, and termination. Practice to consider. Commissioner can decide prosecution will be Detrimental if officer has no disciplinary history, has criminal charges pending. Board can reject opinion in 5 days. Commissioner can overrule up to 5 days after that. Not necessarily appropriate. Commissioner can lower discipline recommended by board. They have 5 days to challenge board and respondent. Not necessarily appropriate. Any questions?
Just quick clarification, the commissioner is the commissioner in charge of the police in this scenario, the police commissioner in New York system?
Yes, I put those in the spreadsheet. Yes, that's correct, Samir, thank you.
So it's the police commissioner. Okay, very good. Thank you. Beautiful. The next 5. Board can recommend discipline when there is a substantial sustained finding, not necessarily appropriate. Board's recommended discipline can note trends and take into account officer history, practice to consider. A civilian administrative charging committee shall recommend discipline in according with a standardized disciplinary matrix. Best practice. The chief of police may deviate upwards from the discipline chosen by the civilian administrative charging committee, but not downwards. Best practice. Any conversation on these 4? Commissioner Dan?
So I just want to say, I put the recommending discipline as a questionable practice because the Portland board is supposed to be able to impose the discipline. So I think it's a good idea that they can recommend it if they're not allowed to actually impose the discipline. But I believe the community voted for a board that can actually impose it. I just want to ask Commissioner Lloyd about the state of Maryland. I think that your comment earlier was that you used the term best practice, but more practice to consider the things that you found in Maryland necessarily, or do you have another comment on that? Thank you.
Commissioner.
Yeah. Thanks, Dan, for asking. Yeah, I would say practice to consider is maybe more appropriate there. I think I might have thought on some of these, you know, in their system, this is a best practice, but in our, for us, I think it may be a practice to consider.
Great, thank you. All right, going on. An officer has a right to reject the discipline recommended by the chief and ACC. An officer may request a trial board be convened for further review. Best practice. Discipline committee, subset of police commission, makes final call when oversight agency and police chief disagree on findings and discipline. Best practice. Citizen Review Board makes recommendations for discipline action, but they do not have the power to execute it. It's up to the police department to follow the recommendations. When they decide they will not follow the recommendation, they will have to say why they won't. Avoid. Board can recommend discipline in cases they investigate or when complaints are made. Practice to consider. Conversation? Commissioner Lavisa.
Well, I think I would say the same thing about this state of Maryland item. It might be a practice to consider, or it might even be a practice to avoid. You know, I'm happy to have that.
So you want to flag that for conversation?
Discussion as well, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Once again, in their system, it is a best practice, but maybe not for us.
Thank you. Thank you for getting through this section quickly. Next section, please. Intake. Staff reviews every complaint. Board reviews the complaints denied by staff. Not necessarily appropriate. Civilian can file at review agency or police department. Practice to consider. Complaints can be filed online, by phone, email, mail, in person, or at a police station, officer, supervisor, or mayor. Practice to consider. Supervisor calls complaint to explain policy. If complainant is not satisfied, forwards for an investigation. Not necessarily appropriate. Complaint can be filed by phone, in person, by mail. The form is available in 6 languages. Practice to consider. Comment or conversation? Commissioner Dan.
Well, I think this section is going to contain a lot of stuff, kind of like the findings, where there are a bunch of different ways that you can file complaints, and hopefully they'll be proposed as a smorgasbord that we can pick from. The DOJ, and I am aware the DOJ is watching tonight, the DOJ required Portland to open this up to kind of this broad place, number of places that people can file complaints, and I think it caused some confusion because some people end up filing complaints with the police, and it's not even clear to me, I've been studying this system for 30 years, whether or not those complaints always make it back to the independent police review, which was supposed to be the central point of intake when it was created. So there are pros and cons. Like, you want to make it really convenient, make sure everybody can get their complaints in, but then if somehow those complaints don't end up where they need to be, that could be problematic. So I just want to kind of flag that idea for this whole general section. I don't know if it can go under one particular place or not.
Okay.
But probably the one about where that list the mayor is one place where you can file it.
Thank you. All right. Complaint can be filed by phone 8 to 5 Monday through Friday, online by 311, in person at council member offices, by mail, or a police station. Practice to consider. Complaint can be by phone, fax, email, mail, in person, collect call, OKO. Practice to consider. Okay. Members of the public may submit complaints to either a law enforcement agency or to the Civilian Police Accountability Board. Best practice. Centralized place to receive all complaints and to investigate all allegations of all types except for labor law disputes like overtime issues, labor law issues with the police department. Best practice. Any thoughts? Commissioner Lavisa.
Sure, for the state of Maryland, I'm happy to change best practice there to practice to consider. It could just be one of many options.
Thank you.
Christine, Commissioner Dan?
Yes, thank you.
Well, I recognize staff is still working on something. So thank you, though. I've mentioned this before. I just want to be sure this thought doesn't get lost anywhere. The hours, I listed the hours because I think a lot of people, when they work from 9 to 5, they cannot necessarily file a complaint during those work hours. Some people will have the incident happen to them in the evening or on a weekend, and they're going to want to file a complaint. So I just want to make sure we think about having hours for Portland that are beyond Monday to Friday, 8 to 5. And I don't know where to put that.
Thank you. All right. I think this section is complete. Investigative process. Civilian can request that complaint not be investigated. Practice to consider. Investigation must follow federal and state constitutional laws, city charter, board rules and regulations, collective bargaining agreement, and NACOLE ethics code. Practice to consider. Cases categorized as type 1, more serious, or type 2, less serious. Type 1 get formal investigations. Type 2, courtesy service procedure conduct, has supervisor conduct and conduct investigation. Commander can forward for full investigation. Internal affairs also reviews. Not necessarily appropriate. Investigation includes interviews of complainant, officers, witnesses, gathering evidence, including photos, videos, injuries. Practice to consider. Investigation includes interviewing complainant, officers, witnesses, gathering documents and videos. Practice to consider. Any conversation? Commissioner Dan.
You should probably just label this generic term of some kind, but this is another thing where each kind of subsection that we've just read will be reflected elsewhere in other cities, but we might kind of put them all together in a smorgasbord to see which parts we like. So like what laws and rules have to be followed is one. What things are done as steps of the investigation. And then this question about the more serious and less serious cases, if you look at the notes there, there's a thing in Portland called Supervisory Investigations that we didn't really get talked to a lot about by people from the city, that IPR barely has anything to do with, and it's just a police officer investigates their subordinate and then says, well, what you did wasn't very good, or well, I found that you didn't do anything wrong. And I don't know if that's something, again, this is a very, it's one of those things we might get stuck on as a commission, whether or not to continue having the police resolve it themselves, as opposed to having some aspect of the civilian board deal with those lower level complaints. So I just want to flag that idea for future discussion.
Very good. If we can have that note added by staff, that would be lovely. Thank you so much. Okay, we'll move on. In minor investigations, the supervisor can review body cam footage. Practice to consider. Interviews with officers are all recorded. Interviews with civilians are recorded, or it is documented. Why not? Practice to consider. Civilian can have a support person who is not a witness to the incident. Practice to consider. Civilian interview can take place at home, work, or neutral location. Practice to consider. Officer involved shootings, homicide, does criminal investigation, internal affairs, does administrative one. Not necessarily appropriate. Conversation? Commissioner Dan?
Sorry, sometimes the little comments that I made in the justification thing, I explained. So the reason I flagged the internal affairs doing the administrative investigation as not being appropriate is that the new board is supposed to be able to investigate deadly force cases. So it's not, I'm not saying that the homicide detectives won't look at the criminal one necessarily. That's, I don't know if that, even though if that's in the purview of the board to discuss, but the question is whether or not internal affairs should do the investigation, the administrative investigation.
Very good, thank
But
you.
I think we should leave in the thing where the homicide detectives do that. So if it's something that the board wants, I mean, the commission wants to discuss, that should stay in there as a thought, which is why I left it in there.
Thank you. Okay, let's go ahead and move on to the next 5. Officer involved shooting. Officers receive Liebbarger Garrity warning that they are being compelled to testify for administrative investigation, and this information can't be used in a criminal proceeding. Best practice. Board conducts independent administrative review of completed investigations. Best practice, or I'm sorry, practice to consider. Investigators recommend findings. Practice to consider. Civilian is only told when case is opened and closed. Not necessarily appropriate. Internal Affairs has authority over theft of money, neglect of duty, corruption, perjury, and off-duty criminal conduct. Practice to consider. Conversation? Yes, Commissioner Sophia. You need to unmute. Yeah. there
I
you go.
had a question about number line 175. The last part, it's saying that administrative and the information from the administrative investigation cannot be used in a criminal proceeding. I'm just trying to understand that. If somebody could explain that, that'd be great.
Commissioner Dan.
Yeah, well, this is unfortunately one of those very fundamental things that I kind of wish we had had a lecture about when we started our discussions as a commission. Basically, if you get called in to testify to the police about if you shot somebody, you can say, I plead the Fifth Amendment because I have the right to say that. I don't want to incriminate myself. So that's the constitutional right. If you call the officer in and say, you shot that person, you broke our policies, we order you to talk to us about it, or else we're going to fire you for not responding to our questions, then if you take what they said and try to prosecute them for that, then you violated their Fifth Amendment right. Does that make sense, Commissioner Grant? Do you understand what I'm saying? Yeah. So you can't like bypass the Constitution by saying either you answer our questions or you get fired. So therefore, you can only use what they say for the administrative investigation. So that really stinks. So that the officer says, "Yeah, I killed that guy because I felt like killing him." You say, "Well, you can't use that." So hopefully, the police department will then fire the person for their clear violation of policy, but then they can't be prosecuted because they said that. That would have to be discovered in another way for the court to prosecute the officer.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the clarity. Yeah. Any other comments, questions? Let's keep going. Investigators use roll calls, logs, assignments, stop and frisk date from police department to identify officers. practice to consider. Civilian can check status of case online, practice to consider. If civilian or their attorney wants to suspend investigation, it can be halted and reopened later, practice to consider. Investigators may interview complainant, officers, and witnesses. Not necessarily appropriate. Can review video, medical records, and conduct site visits. Practice to consider. Any conversation? Next step, please. Civilian can have up to 2 support people, including counsel. Practice to consider. Interviews done at reasonable hours can be rescheduled. Practice to consider. Officers are given name of person in charge of investigation, investigators, if they are subjects or witnesses, nature of allegations, and if not protected by confidentiality, names of complainant and witnesses. Not necessarily appropriate. No offensive language, off the record comments, threats allowed, nor rewards offered. Practice to consider. Only board investigators can record interviews. Practice to consider. Comments, questions? Okay, next slide, please. Interviews will include accommodations for people with disabilities, interpreters, best practice. Investigation includes interviews of witnesses, involved officers, gathers reports, photos and videos. Practice to consider. Officers receive Liebarger warning against self-incrimination, best practice. Interviews may be recorded, not necessarily appropriate. Investigations to be ethical, independent, thorough, timely, fair, and impartial, not to embarrass any party, including institutions. Practice to consider. Conversation, questions? Next slide, please. Cases can be dismissed if complainant cannot be contacted or is uncooperative, if board does not have jurisdiction, if complainant is untimely, if officer is no longer employed, if there is no merit, if investigation not finished in a year. Practice to consider. If officer retires or resigns, investigation can continue. Practice to consider. Transparency for investigations. Practice to consider. Investigation includes recommendation for how to avoid misconduct or improve response. Best practice. According to sources in Oakland, there is a California law that places a statute of limitations on completing complaint disciplinary process of 1 year. If the deadline is not met, the complaint investigation and disciplinary process is terminated. Practice to avoid. Civilian board and internal affairs running parallel investigations. Avoid. Anything else? Any conversation? I was wondering if
Christine, sorry, Dr. Montes.
Sophia? Mhm.
Yes, Sophia, thank you.
So I was looking at line number 195, and I wanted to flag that for further discussion. There's quite a few things in there I think we might want to consider. When I say consider, meaning maybe not the best practices of some of those items.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Commissioner Dan.
Dr. Moses, I know you're about to suggest a break, but just if you look at my justification for that line, Commissioner Glenn, I said you have to be really careful when you create a list like that, not to make it too easy to dismiss complaints. So Portland has a similar list, and we are very, at Portland Cop Watch, we're always very worried that they're overusing some of them to dismiss complaints. So I agree with you.
Thank you for that refinement. Yes, I am going to suggest a break, and I would like 7 minutes, so 8:22. May we please return at 8:22. Thank you so much. Let's go ahead and go back to our wonderful spreadsheet. All right, miscellaneous. Uniform 3-tier structure for entire state. Best practice. Thoughts? Okay, next section.
Oh, hi.
So
Hi,
sorry.
sorry. Louisa has a comment.
I should look up and see if anybody has raised their hand.
That is okay. That is okay. This is another one that I think we should change to, I would say maybe not necessarily appropriate.
Very
Thank you.
good. Thank you. Time frame for filing complaints. 90 days to file complaints. Exceptions can be made by executive director if a person is in jail or fears retaliation. Practice to consider. 18 months by statute, but chair and executive director can reopen. Practice to consider. Complaints filed within 1 year, but told if complaint is incarcerated or incapacitated. Practice to consider. Deadline to file community complaints. Best practice. Conversation, yes, Commissioner Dan.
Oh, I think that last one from Denver, it says that they encourage people not to wait longer than 60 days, but they don't have a firm deadline.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. And I have a question on 160. Yeah, told, but told if complainant is incarcerated. What does that mean? Do we know what that?
Tolling, yeah, I'm sorry, I still have my hand up. So tolling is that so let's say the person is incarcerated for 6 months and they the complaint is there, but they can't investigate it because the person's in jail. So those 6 months don't count towards the 1 year deadline. So okay. I don't know why that's called tolling, but it's a term that they use in this atmosphere or whatever that we're in.
Thank you for that. Appreciate that. It really helps to understand the meaning of that. Any other questions or conversation around these? Okay, we can move on. Commissioner Dan, do you mind lowering your hand? Thank you. Independent legal counsel has independent legal counsel, but is represented by the U.S. attorney in court. Practice to consider. Board required to retain legal counsel on contract or as employee currently has a $180,000 contract. Executive director hires. Best practice. Board has lawyers to support hearings, but not legal counsel separate from city attorney. not necessarily appropriate. Authority for civilian agency and/or oversight board to hire independent counsel, best practice. Board has independent legal counsel, best practice. Conversation, thoughts? Commissioner Dan.
Since Commissioner Jason's not here, does anybody know, since Washington DC is a very strange entity in our country that's not a state or a city really, I mean, it is a city, but it doesn't have representation. Do they have a city attorney? Does anybody know? Okay, I'll look into it.
Thank you, Commissioner Dan. Appreciate that. Our next is topic is board authority cases. Board has authority over officer-involved shootings, deaths in custody, and other specific incidences, force resulting in bodily injury, dishonesty, including perjury, false reports, and concealing evidence, cases of substantial public interest where data shows a pattern of inappropriate policies, sexual misconduct, physical assaults, and domestic violence. Practice to consider. Board can audit lower level cases not described in DH-81 and send them to investigation if problems are found. Practice to consider. Board has access to internal affairs Monday through Friday, 7:30 a.m. to 5 p.m., extendable to 7:30 p.m. some days, and Saturday mornings when there is not a holiday. Practice to consider. Investigates unlawful search and arrest, biased policing, dishonesty, sexual assaults, use of force with bodily injury/death, officer shootings, misconduct, improper performance, including unwarranted action, neglect of duty, use of force, and conduct unbecoming like rudeness. Practice to consider. Board has no authority if officer was off duty, not necessarily appropriate. Comments or questions? Commissioner Dan, would this be one of your smorgasbords?
Yes, it would be one of my smorgasbords. Yes, thank you for being way ahead of me. Also, just so you can, I think staff has just unhidden A, so you realize that DH-81 is the row above that comment. And I also wanted to say the thing about the board not having authority over officers being off duty. I never got through to talk to anybody in San Francisco about that question, about why that happened. And there have been a number of cases in Portland where officers were off duty and did some horrific things. And I think that we should think about whether the board here should be able to process those cases as misconduct. Because there are directives or policies that guide officers off-duty activities.
So you would want this to be flagged to have a conversation, or
yeah. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. All right, our next 5. Board can look at complaints about excessive, did we do that one? Okay, board can look at complaints about excessive force, discrimination, sexual harassment, improper discharge of firearms, illegal search and seizure, false arrest, false reporting, criminal conduct, death caused by law enforcement, misconduct, improper or illegal act, omission, or decision that directly affects a person or property, violation of orders, unbecoming conduct, including discourtesy, harassment, intimidation, procedure, retaliation, untruthfulness, use of force with injury, force used at protests. Practice to consider. Oversight Board has authority to direct, monitor, to investigate certain cases, review closed cases when the monitor conducted the investigation. Board has access to certain portions of personnel files, investigative files, and may make recommendations regarding quality of investigation and findings and discipline, best practice. Designate categories of cases for automatic investigation by civilian review agency, regardless of internal affairs role. Cases include use of force, in custody deaths, profiling, protected classes, untruthfulness, and First Amendment assemblies. Best practices. One board like COPA that takes all complaints. Best practices. Any conversation or questions? Commissioner Dan.
So I have another kind of overarching comment that relates to the, the creation of these long lists. But at first, I believe the Denver thing, the word monitor, I think that's supposed to be capitalized there because that is the name of the head of the staff of the review board there. And Commissioner Iona, correct me if I'm wrong.
That's
So my
true,
overall,
yeah.
okay, my overall comment, and I'm hoping this isn't offensive, but there are all these stories throughout history. One of the famous ones is the monkey's paw, where people make a wish, and then because they weren't specific about what they wished for, the genie or whatever gives them the most horrible version of the wish that they wanted. And that's why I think it's important for us to have these lists and be as specific as possible when we present our package to City Council. I'm definitely going to make those comments again in front of the whole commission, but I just want to be clear that, a lot of people think that we're getting too nitty gritty or too into details or too, micromanaging. But when we don't do that, we risk that genie coming back and tricking us and doing something that we didn't expect. So that's why I find these things very important and informative. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Next 5, please. A standing civilian police accountability board receives complaints, appoints civilians to a civilian charging committee and to any necessary trial boards, and reviews all data regarding complaints and submits an annual report each year to the local council. The civilian PAB identifies trends and makes policy recommendations about the complaint process, best practice. Board has authority to send cases to district attorney, grand jury, and other authority for criminal investigation. Note, staff believes this power has never been used in San Diego. Practice to consider. Thoughts? Questions? Commissioner Lavisa.
Yeah, I would recommend once again changing the Maryland item from best practice to practice to consider.
Thank you.
And or not necessarily appropriate. I'm realizing that I kind of mashed a few things together there. So yes.
Okay. Very good. Commissioner Dan.
Well, regarding your last comment there, Commissioner Lloyd, I was wondering if you think that maybe we should pull out the part about the policy recommendations and put that into the policy section, so that, or leave it there, but also put it in the policy section, just so that it doesn't get.
Sure. Well, I'm looking at it and I'm realizing that I think we could actually, we could delete receives complaints, because there already is another line about the Civilian Police Accountability Board receiving complaints, I think under intake. And that is one thing that would simplify it. Sorry, what was your recommendation, Dan?
Well, I'm realizing that the making policy recommendations is part of the process of dealing with the cases, but is also specifically about the making policy recommendations, which is a completely other section. I don't know if it's already appears there, but I don't know if you want to pull it out of here and put it there or leave it in both places.
You know, I think it almost might be, this really almost might be like three separate items. I think it probably could just be broken out into 3 separate sentences and then categorized appropriately by each sentence.
Do you want staff to do that? Commissioner Lavisa?
I mean, sure, if staff are available to do that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think that exactly, yeah. I think that first sentence could be broken at the comma and.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. I think we can move on. Staff. 22 people on staff, 11 investigators, 3 supervisors, some are former law enforcement from other jurisdictions, deputy director, administrative staff, public affairs, community engagement person. Practice to consider. ED hires other staff, currently 6 people, day-to-day operations, responds to public inquiries, takes complaints, prepares reports, liaison to city, sends meeting notices, prepares minutes. Practice to consider. Commission staff is police sergeant and the secretary, not necessarily appropriate. Department of Police Accountability has audit, mediation, policy, investigation, records, and outreach divisions. Practice to consider. Board has 180 employees. Practice to consider. Thoughts or questions? Commissioner Dan.
Can you read my mind, Dr. Moses? Can you read my mind? I think we should make a list that we can pick and choose from of what kind of staff and what kind of divisions the board should have.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, thank you. So civilian investigators are trained on policies, interviewing, evidence, control mandates, operations, legal issues, including force, stops, frisks, and searches. Practice to consider. Civilian investigators spend 2 days at the police academy. Practice to consider. Civilian investigators must have 8 years of experience. Practice to consider. NYPD gives legal and administrative guidance. Practice to consider. Board has outreach unit, intra-government unit, racial profiling unit, and more. Practice to consider. Questions? Comments? Commissioner Dan.
Right. So another list within this subcategory is a list of what kind of training the investigator should have or experience, where it could be a list of stuff that we can consider down the line.
Beautiful. Yes, NYPD gives legal, let's see, no, yeah, okay. Total of 8 employees, including at least 1 investigator and legal counsel. not necessarily appropriate. Agency director is hired and serves at the pleasure of the oversight board. Best practice. Appoint screening committee to select candidates for agency director. Candidates will be forwarded to oversight board. After a community process, oversight board selects new agency director. The screening committee is made up of the oversight board chair, city council member, current or retired judge, director of career services authority, person with extensive knowledge of police oversight or internal investigations, but has never worked in Denver in law enforcement, and a justice system involved community member selected by the oversight board. Best practice. Employ a community process when selecting agency director. Denver's screening committee forwards 3 agency director candidates to oversight board. The board conducts a community process, then selects a candidate to recommend to city council for appointment. City council confirms the oversight board has the authority to fire the agency director. Best practice. And citizen review board will be volunteers from the community, small stipend for their work. Oh, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Let's just go back to the previous 4. I apologize. Yeah. Questions, concerns, comments? Commissioner Monica.
I'm just a little concerned about making Denver's process as a best practice, just because it looks like that would be ideally somebody that is not from Denver. So hiring somebody that is not from Portland and doesn't know the Portland system very well, I would be a little bit concerned about that. So I'd like to flag that for further discussion or to change to something else.
Thank you. Very good. Thank you. Citizen review board will be volunteers from the community, small stipend for their work. They will have an executive director that is paid city staff, paid city position, as well as full staffers paid by the city to support the work of the CRB. Their budget is limited to less than 1% of the police department's budget. It remains to be seen, not quite at work yet. Consider experience working with community along with investigative, policy, and management skills when hiring agency director. Possible best practice. CPP hopes to create a position for an analyst. They expressed an interest in having a communications person and a person to handle these matters. Practice to consider. Yes. And consider number 137 as a item for a different document. Commissioner Dan.
Oh, I'm not sure what that comment meant. You can respond to that when I'm done with my other comment. I think that number 135 is a similar one to what Commissioner Lloyd had before. So we have 3 thoughts in there. One is the review board having stipends, which is, there's another section about that. One is about the executive director, which is the section we're in. And the third one is about the budget, which is also another section. So I'm wondering if those 3 could be broken up in that way.
Yes.
Can you explain to me what that means about having this in another document?
The other documents that get made along the way, these 3 different documents, I'm thinking that this comment may not be appropriate for this particular document because it is oh, where are we? Oh, hopes to create an analyst position. It doesn't exist yet. It would be, it would land in the expert document. Would be my suggestion. Commissioner Dan.
Yeah, well, we have quite a number of things like this scattered throughout that we've already gone over this evening, where things were expressed about stuff that people want to do. I mean, some of it was from other cities where they hadn't gone into effect yet, or things that exist that they don't use. I don't think we need to pull it out. I think we just leave it in there as an idea. So the idea is to have an analyst and a communications person and somebody to handle personnel matters. It's just another thing to put on a list. It's not saying that somebody's already doing it somewhere. It's just that somebody who's involved in a review board has put this forward as an idea for us. So I understand what you're saying on the one hand, but I just kind of, I don't think we need that level of nuance in our putting these things into a list of things for us to consider, if that's all right.
That's absolutely fine. Commissioner Sophia. You're still on mute. You're still on mute. You went away.
Okay, I'm sorry. There's just a lot of background noise here. So what I was going to say is, in response to the comment from Dan, is that we have a lot more space on the experts document too, and we'll just be reviewing those all just to see which ones we can make the document a little smaller and include those on the others. That's all. Thank you.
Okay, we'll continue on. We're getting close. Collective bargaining. A representative from the police commission has a seat at the bargaining table in contract negotiations. Best practice. More transparent collective bargaining. Best practice. The Oakland Police Commission lists the names of its commissioners and alternates on their meeting agendas. Best practice. Thoughts? Questions? Commissioner Dan?
I think that third one might have been a mistake when I was first categorizing these things. I think it's supposed to be in the next in a different section about meetings. But the police having a commission member, and commission here, we're talking about the new board, not one of us, sit in on the collective bargaining. I really want to flag that as something that our commission considers recommending to City Council. I think that's a tremendous idea.
And I see Commissioner Lavisa doing the finger agreement. Yes, thank you. All right. Moving up. Reporting. There's an annual report and semi-annual review and a use of force report. Practice to consider. Case decisions are posted online without the officer or complainant's names, but with facts of the case supporting the findings. Practice to consider. Semi-annual reports required to mayor and council on duties and powers, case summaries, redacted, committee work. Best practice. Reports include, not necessarily required, statistics on how board votes on discipline. Practice to consider. Minutes of meetings are published. Practice to consider. Questions, comments? And so Commissioner Dan thinks that the one on names of members was supposed to be in the section on reporting, which is
right.
Yeah.
That was one of the comments I was going to make. Then I also would say that this is another area where the frequency of reports and the content of reports is something that we should have as a list to select from with the full commission. Commissioner Iona and I could probably go on and on for about half an hour about what should and shouldn't be in the annual reports and what has been pulled out of the annual reports in this city over the last 20 years, unfortunately. But for the time being, let's just see, we have a list of things we might want to put into the new board's reports.
Very good. Thank you. Anyone else? Next 5. Online dashboard shows case statistics, open, closed, sustained allegations and findings. Annual report includes cases, allegations, demographics, info broken down by city district, policy recommendations and their status and outreach. Practice to consider, and so is the practice to consider of the one above. Data on officer-involved shootings includes names of officers and dates. Practice to consider. Discipline letters with officers' names posted online. Practice to consider. Online sections include sample cases, complaints, allegations, victims and officers. Data includes race, gender, age, and outcomes. Questions, thoughts? Commissioner Monica.
Just that I did find in Philadelphia that reports like the ones in San Francisco are also going to be published in Philadelphia. So wanted to add jurisdictions to the online reports and annual reports and officer involved shooting with officer names and dates. That is also happening in Philadelphia.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Monica. Anyone else? This 103, is this a practice to consider or avoid? No,
It's supposed to be a practice to consider. I did like 250 lines, so I just skipped that one by accident.
Great, thank you. Policy unit puts out monthly, semi-annual, and annual reports on data 14 times a year. Practice to consider. Data on open and mediated cases are not public, not necessarily appropriate. Board can propose release of previously confidential information. Practice to consider. Monthly statistical reports generated before each meeting. Practice to consider. Reports include agency operations, complaint activity, case dispositions, and discipline. Practice to consider. Comments, questions? Okay, we'll continue. Shared at meetings. Agendas, minutes, summary and statistical reports, early warning reports sent to agency heads. Practice to consider. Annual report includes board activities, recommendations and outcomes, trends, board mission, staff, members' biographies, messages from the chair and executive director, complaints by year, quarter, allegations by unit, type, and agency, lists board actions by case number, date and findings, lists death cases. Practice to consider.
Dr. Christine Moses,
I'm sorry.
Commissioner Sophia wants to talk. Okay.
Yes, please.
I'm sorry, I'm a little late. I wanted to go back to, if you could scroll back to the last section. I'm sorry. Data on open and mediated cases are not public. That one, it's just not necessarily appropriate. Never mind. Sorry, thank you.
Okay. Thank you for interrupting me. I get on a roll. I apologize. Spell out required contents of agency and commission annual reports in code. Best practice. The Seattle Community Police Commission has an online tracker showing the status of its recommendations and those of the Office of Police Accountability and the Office of Inspector General to the Seattle Police Department, the OIG, and the OPA. See the URL. Seattle also has an online tracker showing which provisions in the 2017 accountability ordinance have been implemented. It also shows the reason why some have not been implemented. The primary reason is the collective bargaining agreement with the police union. Best practice. Conversations, questions? Next set. Set number of oversight board meetings focused on public comment with one specifically tied to oversight board's annual report. Best practice. Every case reviewed is posted with detail on complaints, findings, and outcomes with names, if complainant allows, as well as names of officers involved. Reports will be published in public websites that are easy to search and are able to be used for looking at patterns, etc. Best practice. The Seattle Office of Police Accountability posts closed summaries online. They include a summary of the incident and alleged misconducts, as well as the director's response to each misconduct allegation. If discipline is imposed, the type and severity of discipline are also included. Names of involved officer and complainants are not included. Best practice. The Oakland Police Commission lists the names of commissioners and alternates on their meeting agenda. We looked at that earlier. Best practice. Conversation, questions? Commissioner Monica.
I'm not sure I would call 115 a best practice. I would, yeah. Just because of not naming names of officers involved, I think is an old practice that we need to stop.
Thank you so much, Commissioner Sophia.
I just wanted to add to number 113, just to say, it's just say a minimum set number of practices, not necessarily a set number. Just maybe clarify that a little bit. Because I don't want it to be limited, but I don't want it to be overkill either. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Just consider that to be a little more flexible. Thank you.
So I would like to do a time check. Thank you, everyone. It is now 9 p.m. and I cannot believe how fast this has gone. Just zoom through. We have 92 items, and I think we need to do them on Thursday when we meet again. We'll finish this document. Is that the consensus of the group? I'm seeing hands and thumbs and wiggles. Very good. I would like to go to public comment.
Well, I think Commissioner Handelman has a comment.
Very good. Commissioner.
Well, I just want to point out that we have 90 lines on this tab of the spreadsheet to go, but there's also the expert tab, and I don't know how many lines are in that.
About 90. Oh, I'm sorry, 50-ish.
Thank you.
Yes. Is it all right for me to move on to public comment? Very, very good. Thank you. We will now take public comment on the issues the subcommittee is discussing, or community members can also tell their story about policing and police accountability. We will ask members of the public to keep their comments or questions to 2 minutes in length and raise their hand in Zoom if you would like to speak. I do not see any people raising their hands in Zoom. So we will move forward to the garden plot recap. Victoria, I would like to call on you first. Do you have any garden plot?
Yes, I only have one thing, and is whether or not we should have any cases continue to be investigated, resolved by police for minor cases, for example.
Very good, thank you.
Yeah.
Staff, do you have any garden plot?
Nothing that isn't already noted in the spreadsheet. Thank you.
Beautiful. Co-chairs, do you have any garden plots?
No, I don't have.
No, okay, very good. Then I would like us to close out this meeting. Thank you to all of the members who attended today's meeting and for your contributions today. Thank you also to the interpreters supporting access to the meetings of the Police Accountability Commission and its subcommittee for all Portlanders. Finally, thank you to the members of the community for attending and contributing your thoughts and questions, and commissioners, thank you for your thoughtfulness this evening. Community members, you can give advanced public comment prior to future meetings at tinyurl/Portland PAC comment. You can sign up for email updates at the PAC's work at tinyurl.com/Portland PAC updates. It is now 9:04 and this meeting is adjourned. Thank you.